Hello, everyone. This week we're going over race and ethnicity as lived experiences. So, before we get started, we need to talk about how to define race and ethnicity. A lot of individuals often think that these two concepts can be used interchangeably, but they are actually very different. Race is a socially defined category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. We usually think of race as physical attributes that a person has, such as skin color, hair type, and eye color. Humans, regardless of their race, are 99.9% genetically identical. However, race is still used to classify people, and sometimes race is a basis for differential treatment of individuals or groups of people. Sociologists, then, have come to understand race as a social category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. Race is more meaningful to us on a social level than on a biological level. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is a socially defined category based on common language, religion, nationality, history, and other cultural factors. For example, the Amish are a distinct ethnic group in American society. They are linked by a common heritage that includes language, religion, and history. The Amish people, with few exceptions, are also white. Another example would be Jewish people. Contrary to what the Nazis and other white supremacists may believe, Jewish people are an ethnic group and they are not a race. Ethnicity and race are sometimes related, but they are not inextricably linked. There are also consequences to how we categorize people based on race and ethnicity, as portrayed in the chapter opener on racial profiling and driving while black. So it's important to understand that race is a social construction. Sociologists see race and ethnicity as social constructions because race isn't based on biology. For instance, we don't test DNA to determine race. Racial categories change over time. If you look at the US Census, you will see that the categories of races change very frequently. In fact, 2000 was the first year that respondents were allowed to select one or more races in their racial category. Prior to 2000, respondents were forced to select only one race, even if they would describe themselves as biracial or multiracial. Racial categories never have firm boundaries. Instead, the boundaries defining racial categories are flexible. For example, there is no set regulation for determining racial identity. A person may have ancestry from mixed descent, yet may not identify with that descent. Or a person who was born in the United States and whose parents and grandparents were also born in the United States might classify him or herself as Cuban because a great-grandparent was from Cuba. We also have to make the distinction between race and ethnicity. This is important because ethnicity can be displayed or hidden depending on individual preferences, whereas racial identities are always on display. Racial identities are based on physical attributes. Ethnicity, however, is not. It's based on the common language and nationality and other cultural factors. So we can hide our ethnicity or display it if we choose. So to help you understand this, I would like you to guess the nationality or ethnicity of this individual. Could he be Dutch, Irish, German, or American? The answer to this question is actually German. Most individuals would probably say wouldn't know or would guess because they're trying to base it off of physical attributes. So, in a sense, they are trying to figure out the race of the individual, which is not the same thing as ethnicity. Can you guess the nationality or ethnicity of this woman? Is she a Philippine, a Vietnamese, an African American, or a Peruvian? This woman is actually a Philippine. Can you guess the nationality or ethnicity of this woman? Is she Canadian, Turkish, Greek, or Dominican? This woman is actually a Dominican. So again, this just points out that racial characteristics, physical attributes, do not help us understand ethnicity, and that ethnicity can actually be hidden or displayed depending on the individual. As mentioned previously, ethnicity can be displayed or hidden. There can be a symbolic ethnicity, and there can be situational ethnicity. Symbolic ethnicity is an ethnic identity that is only relevant on special occasions and does not significantly impact everyday life. You may have a friend whom you've met recently who surprised you because you had no idea that she was of Irish heritage until St. Patrick's Day, when she proudly displayed her ethnicity. This ethnicity may not impact her day-to-day life, but it becomes relevant in this occasion. This is an example of symbolic ethnicity. There's also situational ethnicity, and it's an ethnic identity that can be either displayed or concealed depending on its usefulness in a given situation. Situational identity may not be relevant on a certain date, but rather based on a certain situation. For example, if you are of a certain ethnicity and you know that your employer is prejudiced against people of your ethnicity, you may choose to not disclose your identity in an effort to preserve your job. However, when you are applying for financial aid at college and you see that there is a scholarship available for someone with your ethnicity, you may choose to reveal your ethnic identity in this potentially beneficial situation. And so here are a couple pictures of symbolic ethnicity. This is when individuals often have festivals and celebrations, and they'll dress up and do traditional dances and wear traditional clothing. And this just represents that there are symbols associated with ethnicity. Along with ethnicity and race, we also have to examine minority groups. Minority groups are social groups that are systematically denied access to power and resources that are available to the dominant groups of a society. It is important to know that minority groups are not necessarily fewer in number than the dominant group. For example, in South Africa, blacks dramatically outnumber whites by a ratio of 7-1. Yet before the 1994 election of President Nelson Mandela, whites controlled the country, whereas blacks occupied the lower status in that society. Minority does not mean numerically inferior. It refers to the group that has less access to resources or power. However, it is interesting to note that the unequal and unfair treatment of a minority group typically generates a strong sense of common identity and solidarity among group members. We see this in movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement or feminist movements, because these individuals who are of minority group come together to share their identity and to fight against inequality. This pie chart shows the racial and ethnic populations in the United States in 2016. We see that whites and non-Hispanics make up the larger percentage of the population. They are 60% of the population. We also know that whites and non-Hispanics are a part of the dominant group, not because they are larger in number, but because they do have access to the resources and power that other groups don't in this society. Following whites, we have Hispanics and Latinos. They make up 18% of the population. Blacks or African Americans make up 13%. Asians make up 5.7%. American Indians make up 1.3%, and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander make up 0.2%. There is a small percentage of people that claim that they are two or more races. Now that we've examined race and ethnicity, it's important to go over racism and its many forms. Racism is a set of beliefs about the claimed superiority of one racial or ethnic group. It is used to justify inequality, and it's often rooted in the assumption that differences between groups are genetic. Sometimes people argue that racism is no longer an issue in the United States. It is true that our race relations have changed, but many sociologists argue that racism has not been eliminated. In the past, it was socially acceptable in many places to display racist attitudes and to use racial slurs. That's not politically correct or acceptable anymore, so people tend to reserve their attitudes until they know they are in like-minded company. However, this is in no way means that racism has been eliminated. It's just more difficult to identify sometimes, which many people argue is actually worse. Sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva argues that colorblindness makes these subtle forms of racism difficult to acknowledge and address productively. Colorblind racism is an ideology that removes race as an explanation for any form of unequal treatment. Other parts of racism include prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is a thought process, whereas discrimination is an action. So it is important to distinguish between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is an internal evaluation. It is an idea about the characteristics of a group, it is applied to all members of that group, and it is unlikely to change regardless of the evidence against it. Discrimination is an action of actual unequal treatment of individuals because of their social group, and it is usually motivated by prejudice. While it makes sense to see these things as happening chronologically or in order, it is important to know that that's not always the case. Some people may be prejudiced, but they don't discriminate against individuals. Others may discriminate yet not be prejudiced. For example, a manager may refuse to hire Chinese individuals because other people in the office don't like them, even though the manager himself doesn't actually dislike Chinese people at all. There are two kinds of discrimination: individual and institutional discrimination. While any kind of discrimination is problematic, institutional discrimination is bigger than individual discrimination and more difficult to address. Individual discrimination is a type of discrimination by one individual against another. Institutional discrimination refers to a structural disadvantage for an entire group of individuals based on their group membership. Institutional discrimination is often more difficult to observe because it is not just one person acting against another. It may instead be embedded in policies, rules, traditions, or beliefs, and usually no one person can be held accountable. Therefore, eliminating institutional discrimination is a significantly more challenging task than eliminating individual discrimination. The Black Lives Matter movement is an example of institutional discrimination, as it exists to oppose policies and practices of social institutions that perpetuate discrimination against racial minority groups. There are several other forms of racism. White nationalism is the belief that the nation should reflect a white identity. White privilege involves unearned advantages for dominant group members, and colorblind racism is an ideology that disqualifies race as an explanatory factor for inequality. Most white individuals don't recognize that they do have privilege. It is often unconsciously known. Because they are born with these advantages, they don't necessarily see them as advantageous. Whereas individuals from minority groups are aware that they don't have the privileges that whites do, and that they don't have the access to resources and power that whites do, and so it is more apparent to them than white individuals. There are also microaggressions, which consist of everyday verbal and nonverbal communications that are denigrating or dismissive. There is cultural appropriation, which occurs when dominant group members adopt aspects of an oppressed group's culture without permission and for gain. Rachel Dolezal, if you don't know who she was a civil rights activist. She was a part of the NAACP. She was actually a local chapter leader. She was also a professor of Africana Studies. It was later found out that Dolezal is a white woman who identified as black, which shows that cultural appropriation is not a simple matter. There's also reverse racism, which is the claim by whites that they are discriminated against due to their race. There are anti-racist allies that are whites who work alongside people of color to end racial injustice as well. So now that we've examined racism in its many forms, the definitions of race and ethnicity, as well as minority groups, it is important to understand the theoretical approaches to understanding race. The first one that we will examine is structural functionalism. Structural functionalism focuses on the way in which race creates social ties and strengthens group bonds. It acknowledges that such ties can lead to violence and social conflict between groups. Functionalist theories state that racial and ethnic differences are a necessary part of society. Even racial inequality has functions that help maintain social order. Conflict theory focuses on the struggle for power and control over scarce resources. Early conflict theorists tried to explain race as a result of economic oppression. The theory states that racial and ethnic differences create intergroup conflict. Minority and majority groups have different interests and may find themselves at odds as they attempt to secure and protect those interests. Symbolic interactionism focuses on the ways in which class, race, and gender intersect to produce an individual's identity. It sees race as an aspect of identity that is established through interaction. So if you'll remember, last week we went over intersectionality, and you watched a video from Kimberly Crenshaw, who examined intersectionality among Black women in the workforce. So there are several different ways in which we project and receive our racial and ethnic identities. This theory, symbolic interactionism, states that race and ethnicity are part of our presentation of self. There is a thing called racial passing, which is living as if one is a member of a different racial category. And there's a long history of it in the United States. The way in which we are perceived in the physical world, which is our embodied identity, has historically been used as a basis for discrimination. This issue becomes particularly interesting today as we examine online communication, where our physical traits are often remain hidden from those with whom we interact. There's also double consciousness. W.E.B. Du Bois used this term for the divided identity experienced by blacks in the United States. So in a way, there are individuals who have lighter skin color who will be less likely to be discriminated against because of the fact that they have lighter skin, even if they are of African American descent, or if they are half black and half white. They are more likely to receive better benefits than those that have darker skin tones. And so the ones that have light skin tones may actually be able to pass as white in order to receive the white privileges that African Americans don't have. There are also different life chances based on race and ethnicity. Race and ethnicity influences all aspects of our lives, including health, education, work, family, and interactions with the criminal justice and healthcare systems. So Max Weber actually came up with the idea of life chances, which is that our opportunities in life are different depending on the class into which we are born. We also talked earlier about how race and gender intersect with class. So a person's race could also affect these life chances. Healthcare is an area in which we find widespread disparity between racial and ethnic groups. Disparities in access to healthcare may help explain the differing life expectancy rates for men and women of different races. Health is an area in which we find widespread disparity among racial and ethnic groups. For example, infant mortality for black babies is more than double that of white babies. Racism plays a role in these disparities. High levels of racially differentiated stressors affect blacks more intensely than whites and lead to higher levels of chronic disease and lower life expectancies. Whites have typically fared better in health matters than minorities, although this is not always the case. Recent findings reveal a complicated picture of the nation's health when intersections among race, class, and gender are taken into account. One way of measuring health is to look at life expectancy and mortality rates. White male children born in 2015 can expect to live to be around 76 years old, while white females can expect to live to 81. The life expectancy of African American males is 71 years old, and for American females, it's 78. So we can see that life expectancy for whites are higher than those for African Americans, and that males actually have the highest life expectancy over females. It is notable that Hispanics have the highest life expectancy, higher even than whites. 79 years for Hispanic men and 84 years for Hispanic women. Disparities also exist in health insurance. In 2017, 16% of Hispanics and 11% of blacks lacked health insurance compared to just 6% of whites and 7% of Asians. Education is also important to examine. In U.S., education, the highest high school dropout rates are associated with people from economically disadvantaged and non-English speaking backgrounds. Maybe it is true that high school is harder for these individuals, or that they are more likely to have to leave school due to family responsibility. But think about this from a structural perspective. Isn't there any way that the structure of the education system could be modified to encourage these individuals to complete their education rather than dropping out? Could this be an example of institutional discrimination, where the structure of education systematically denies opportunities to people from economically disadvantaged and non-English speaking backgrounds? So if we look at Americans over age 25 with bachelor's degrees, based on their race, we see that Asians have the highest percentage of bachelor degrees at 57%, followed by whites, then blacks, and Hispanics. So Hispanics are least likely to earn a bachelor's degrees once they are over 25, while Asians are the most likely to have a bachelor's degree once they are 25 or older. We can also look at the life chances based on work and income. Inequality can also be seen in the workplace and in income distribution. People of color are less likely to achieve high levels of education and more likely to have lower paying jobs. Inequality in education leads to further inequalities in life. For instance, it is harder to get a high-paying job without a higher level of education. Additionally, without a good job, it is harder to gain access to insurance and health care. In 2016, the median U.S. income for Asian Americans was $81,431. For whites, it was $65,041. For Hispanics, it was $47,675, and for African Americans, it was $39,490. Also, in 2016, 9% of whites lived below the poverty line, as opposed to 20% of African Americans and 19% of Hispanics. There are also differences in life chances with the criminal justice system. African Americans and Hispanics are much more likely to go to prison than whites. African Americans are also far more likely to be murdered than whites. Moreover, 49% of racially motivated hate crimes in 2017 targeted blacks. Is this because non-whites are more violent and commit more crimes, or is it due to other factors, such as the fact that the police are more likely to patrol inner-city areas than gated communities? And it's also, if you have heard of driving while black, you may understand that it is more likely for a black person to be pulled over or arrested than for people of other races. If this phenomenon is accurate, what does that mean of black individuals who interact with the criminal justice system? It's important to note that whites and blacks often commit equal amounts of crime. So it's not that blacks commit more crimes than whites, or that Hispanics commit more crimes than whites and Asians, but that there is racial institutional discrimination, so that blacks and Hispanics are more likely to be pulled over by policemen. They are more likely to be targeted and punished for certain crimes that blacks and Hispanics are more likely to do based on institutional discrimination and lack of income. Whereas whites are more likely to commit white-collar crimes, um, such as fraud, and those things are often overlooked or punished differently. So non-whites are more likely than whites to interact with law enforcement, as mentioned in the previous slide. It's also important to examine intergroup relations and examine genocide and population transfer. Genocide is the deliberate and systematic extermination of a racial, ethnic, national, or cultural group. There are interactions between dominant and subordinate groups, and they can take many different forms. So if we examine genocide, most individuals will think of Nazi Germany. But how about within the United States? Many times, scholars argue that the forced cultural assimilation of Native Americans actually constitutes genocide. There's also population transfer, which is the forcible removal of a group of people from the territory they have occupied. The forced relocation of Native Americans to specific areas, which is Indian reservations, shows an example of population transfer. There's also internal colonialism and segregation. Internal colonialism is the economic and political domination and subjugation of the minority group by the controlling group within a nation. Internal colonialism can be thought of in terms of slavery or indentured servitude. There's also segregation, which is the formal and legal separation of groups by race or ethnicity. As an example of segregation, in the U.S. South up to the 1960s, not only did blacks live in separate neighborhoods, they were restricted to coloreds-only sections of buses, parks, restaurants, and even drinking fountains. We also should talk about assimilation, which I mentioned a couple slides ago when I mentioned the Native Americans. Assimilation is the absorption of the minority group into the mainstream or dominant group, which makes society more homogeneous. There is racial assimilation, where absorption of racial minority groups into the dominant groups through intermarriage. There's also cultural assimilation, which is the absorption of racial or ethnic groups into the dominant group through their adoption of the dominant group's culture. So in this way, Native Americans were forced to be culturally assimilated. So they were forced to get rid of their culture and adopt the dominant group's culture. Assimilation is the central idea behind Americans' melting pot. Minority group members may lose their previous ethnic or racial identity. And lastly, it's important to examine pluralism or multiculturalism. Pluralism is a pattern of intergroup relations that encourage racial and ethnic variation within a society. Pluralism not only permits racial and ethnic variation within one society, it actually encourages people to embrace diversity, to exchange the traditional melting pot image for a salad bowl. At the core of multiculturalism is the tolerance of racial and ethnic differences. So it's okay to be different, and it's actually encouraged to be different in a pluralistic society. This pretty much concludes this week's lecture. So what do we need to do for the rest of the week? We need to finish reading Chapter 8 if you haven't already. Take the inquisitive quiz for Chapter 8, which is due by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday. Read the Hidden Bias article and take the Race IAT test. These are both can be found in your Week 9 folder. You need to participate in the group discussion, which is also due by 11:59 p.m. this Sunday. This is the first one that we've done in a few weeks, so please remember to participate and respond to at least one classmate. And if you'd like, you can actually earn 5 extra credit points by taking another IAT test screenshotting the score and sending it to me via email. This will be due by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Have a great week, everyone. This concludes the lecture slide set for Chapter 8.